David, thank you very much. And with me here at Penrith Stadium this afternoon, we've got a room full of a couple of hundred local business people and community representatives. And as you mentioned, on the stage for this post-budget debate, the Assistant Treasurer David Bradbury and the Shadow Assistant Treasurer Senator Matthias Cormann. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the two men. And with the announcement today, big news in industry and manufacturing by Ford that it's going to shut down manufacturing in Australia within 3 years. That will obviously feature during our questions this afternoon of the two gentlemen. We are going to start with an opening statement from both men, then we'll roll into questions and answers. We'll also take some questions from the floor a little bit later. But David Bradbury, the Assistant Treasurer, will kick off things with an opening statement. Minister.
Thanks very much, Kieran, and can I thank the Penrith Business Alliance for the invitation to be here, and thank Penrith Panthers for that delectable meal. It's good to go into battle on a full stomach, and I'm sure Matthias feels the same way. I think one of the great challenges that we've seen over the last few years is that in so many respects our world has changed. The global financial crisis has really forced us all to reassess the business models that have been underpinning the way we do what we do, and indeed the way we run our economies. And as we find ourselves today in an environment where those easy days of credit have passed, where looking to asset prices to constantly increase at rapid rates, well, those days have passed. And of course, the days of consumers having more and more money to spend and to stimulate our economy have also passed. It's in those new realities, those new economic realities that we face and find ourselves. And it's in that context that we operate in a global environment, and accordingly we really need to assess the strength of any economy around the world in that global context. It's all relative, and in a relative sense our economy continues to be one of the strongest in the world. Now that doesn't mean that there aren't individuals and families and businesses that are facing challenges, but globally we're doing very well. And that's in large part because of the growth our economy has undertaken. Since the GFC, we are now 13% larger as an economy than we were beforehand. No major advanced economy can boast similar growth. And in fact, countries like the UK, they're still in negative territory, and they had an Olympic Games in the middle of that to stimulate growth. In terms of jobs, in the time we've been in office, Kieran mentioned the difficult announcement that was made today, and our thoughts go out to all of the workers at Ford. And that also represents some of the structural changes happening in our economy. But through our time in office, almost 1 million jobs have been created. And our unemployment rate at 5.5% is one of the best in the world. Inflation is contained, our interest rates are at record lows, and we find that we continue to have a strong pipeline of investment coming into our country. Now, one of the most important indicators, one of the most important report cards of our strong economy is our AAA credit rating that we have from all three major advanced or major credit ratings agencies. In fact, this is the first time in our country's history under our government that we've achieved a AAA credit rating under the big three global ratings agencies. That's a big tick from those international agencies. And indeed, when it comes to debt and government public finances, our public finances continue to be very strong. In fact, our net debt is very low by international standards, and in fact recently the former Prime Minister John Howard himself suggested that our net debt was at very low levels compared to the rest of the world. So it's in that context that the budget was handed down last week. And we approached the budget, obviously we had sought to return the budget to surplus in this year, and we've not been able to do that. And we've not been able to do that because we have faced significant write-downs in our revenue. In fact, about $17 billion worth of write-downs in our revenue. In the face of that, we've taken the approach that we took through the global financial crisis, and that is that we will always support economic growth and we will always support jobs. And the budget that we've handed down does both of those things, whilst at the same time delivering savings, responsible savings of about just over $40 billion across the forward estimates period. That's the 4 years of the budgeting cycle.
Minister, 30 seconds.
We've done that because we wanted to invest in the long-term reforms that are critical to our nation's future. And we've done that by opening up the ability to spend money to invest in education, because we believe education is the great enabler and the great productivity generator that as a nation we need to invest in. We've done that at the same time as we've made our society fairer by investing in disability care, and we've made our economy stronger by investing in infrastructure, $24 billion. This budget was about charting a pathway back to surplus, but doing it while supporting growth, supporting jobs. We want a stronger economy, we want a smarter nation, and we want a fairer society. That's the choice that we're presenting to the Australian people, and that was very much the focus of our budget.
The Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Senator Cormann, now your response.
Thank you very much, Kieran. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's great to be back in Penrith to talk about the budget. It's great to be at this venue where the mighty Penrith Panthers defeated the Warriors 62-6 by a massive 62-6 the other day. And it's great to be here with the hard-working federal representative for the Liberal Party, Fiona Scott, here in the seat of Lindsay. Look, one of the best indicators of future performance is past performance. And if we look at the government's past performance when it comes to the budget, then what we have to observe is that the current government, inherited a very strong budget position back in 2007. No government net debt, a $20 billion surplus, about $70 billion worth of Commonwealth net assets. The government was collecting, and I emphasize collecting, more than $1 billion in net interest payments. And of course, what we're looking at after Wayne Swan's most recent budget is now $220 billion worth of accumulated deficits. Government net debt is heading for $191 billion. The government is about to breach its debt ceiling again, taking gross debt past $300 billion. And of course, we're in the past, in the last year of the Howard government, the government was collecting more than $1 billion in net interest payments. The current government is planning to spend $33.4 billion on net interest payments to service the debt that they've accumulated so far. Now, if we look at the government's past promises, I mean, this budget, this most recent budget, is the last budget before the next election. When we were at the same time before the last election, the government promised that we were on a pathway back to surplus, that we would have an early return back to surplus by 2012-13. And as part of that pathway back to surplus, we were told that the deficit in 2011-12 would be $10 billion. Now, the final budget outcome for 2011-12 is that the deficit was $43.7 billion. That is, the deficit position for that year deteriorated more than 4 times. And of course, in 2012-13, instead of the surplus, which my opponent told people in his electorate in a flyer last year had already been delivered, this year, of course, we're going to have a $19.4 billion deficit. But not only are we going to have another deficit this year, we're going to have a deficit next year and the year after. And of course, on top of that, the figures, so this is even if the figures that are predicted in the budget come true, we are going to have at least 3 more deficits, one this year, one next year, and the year after. Now, the government says, well, that is because revenue has collapsed. Well, let me say, that is just completely wrong. Government revenue continues to increase strongly. Government revenue this year has increased, or is on track to increase by 6%. Government revenue next year is predicted to increase by 7%. The problem we have with this government is that they've got their forecasting completely wrong.
30 seconds.
Wayne Swan is a treasurer that plans for the blue sky when it comes to revenue, who comes up with a complex new mining tax, which he says will rise $4 billion in year 1. He spends all the money he thinks it will rise, and more. And then the revenue that actually is collected is 95% below his original forecast. Instead of collecting $4 billion, he collects $200 million, but he's already spent all the money he thought it would rise. So of course this government has got a fiscal problem. This government doesn't have a revenue problem, they've got a spending problem. They've got $80 billion more in revenue today in this year than the last year of the Howard government, but they're spending $120 billion more as well, which is why they've turned the $20 billion surplus into a $20 billion deficit. What we need is we need a government that lives within its means, so that we can have a government which taxes less. So we've got to have a government that cuts red tape, which reduces the cost of doing business, so we can grow the economy more strongly, so we can actually have the government revenue we need to fund the services you're looking for, without the need to keep increasing these taxes as the Labor Party has done over the last few years.
Let's move on. I want to start off with the big news today in manufacturing. The fact that Ford has announced it's going to end manufacturing within 3 years. David Bradbury, Assistant Treasurer, there'll be many taxpayers, I think many people in this room, wondering how we got to this. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in subsidies going to automotive manufacturers over decades. And now we have Ford shutting up shop. No more Falcon, when many of the people in this room, business people, don't get a ZAC. Can you explain to them how we got here?
Well, firstly, I think we should acknowledge and we should remember that there are people who have found out today that they'll be losing their jobs, and that's not something that I think any of us would be pleased to hear, and obviously that's a very big kick in the guts for those people. But we believe it is important that we support manufacturing in this country, and in particular when it comes to the automotive industry. There are people out there, and there have been people out there over the years, that have said we should not provide any support to the manufacturing sector, and in particular the automotive industry. But it is an important part of our manufacturing base.
They're still leaving.
Not just...
They're still leaving.
We're seeing that in relation to Ford, but there still will be and will continue to be a strong manufacturing presence in the automotive industry in Australia. Now, it's not just about supporting that industry, because so many other industries do hang off that industry, the componentry industry, and of course part of the challenge has been trying to ensure that what occurs here in Australia is plugged into the global supply chains of these companies. Now, the point I would make is that we will continue to provide a co-investment in the industry. I know that our opponents have already said that they would cut $500 million from support, which clearly would have implications for those other manufacturers that continue to operate. But there's still another $1.5 billion worth of support that our opponents haven't indicated whether or not they would continue to support that or to rip that away.
Well, let's go to your opponent then, Senator Cormann. As David Bradbury mentioned, $500 million already on the chopping block. Things would be worse for the automotive industry, would they not?
No,
under a coalition government?
Well, no, they wouldn't be. Let me just say up front that obviously it is a very sad day for manufacturing today. It's a sad day for the families of the people that are losing their jobs today, and it's a sad day for the businesses that provide goods and services to Ford. And of course, you know, it's quite appropriate for the federal government and the state government to provide assistance to help through the transition that these families are facing now. Now, having said that, I mean, manufacturing is not going to survive and thrive just on the back of government handouts. If we want manufacturing to do well moving forward, what we've got to do is we've got to make sure that we've got an environment that is appropriately competitive internationally. We've got to look at bringing costs down. We've got to scrap the carbon tax. We've got to be serious about cutting costly red tape. We've got to be serious about improving productivity growth. I mean, a government handing out money they haven't got, and then the businesses are closing down the doors anyway, that is not a sustainable way of making sure that we've got a strong and thriving manufacturing industry.
Doesn't the Coalition's paid parental leave levy also hit manufacturers?
Well, the Coalition's paid parental leave initiative, of course, which would be paid by Australia's 3,000 largest businesses who actually have profits, not those who haven't got profits, because there's of course a levy on profits, that will help improve our productivity. It will help improve our productivity by ensuring we increase workforce participation by women. It will help our productivity by making sure that we can continue to keep our population growth strong by keeping our birth rate high. So I don't think that they're related at all.
On that tax issue, though, what I was about to say, the GST, no, the carbon tax, is not mentioned by Ford, but surely it's another impost, isn't it, that they don't need right now? They're struggling with the high dollar, with labour costs. It's just another cost.
Which our competitors don't face.
Well, I'll let you answer if you'd like, Matthias, but...
Please,
look,
yes.
Clearly, you know, it is a cost. It's not a cost that the company has cited as a reason for the decision that they've taken. But of course, we do believe that what a responsible government must do is plan for the future, and that future will be a future where, as an economy, we will need to be less dependent upon fossil fuels than we have been in the past. And part of that is about pricing carbon through the carbon pricing mechanism, which will transition into an emissions trading scheme. The point you make, Kieran, about the paid parental leave scheme is that on the one hand, Matthias says we don't think you should be providing support in the form of co-investment to the automotive industry because that's taking money from the successful
not what I said, actually,
and giving it to the least successful. But the paid parental leave levy that has been proposed by the coalition, let's be clear about what this is. It is a $20 billion tax on businesses. Now, we've just gone through a debate in this country in the last few years where every single day I've turned on the television screen, Mr Abbott has been there at a business saying if you jack up tax on big business, they will jack up their prices and they will pass that on to everyone. Now, why is it that this $20 billion tax on business is somehow not going to have that impact?
But it's paid on profits. It's not across the board like
happy to explain.
Well, it's paid on profits, accounting profits, and we've seen in recent times that some of the biggest, most profitable companies in the world actually are not paying tax and do not record a taxable income, but that's a separate issue. But the point I would make is we have a parental leave scheme in place. It is a government-funded scheme that provides generous support. Why on earth would we want to put a scheme in place that is going to deliver $75,000 for what could be, you know, someone on an income, the sky's the limit. Someone takes a period of time off and they will get $75,000.
The sky is actually not the limit, and you know that
Well, no,
too.
the sky is the limit, or $75,000, but their income could be $1 million and they're getting $75,000. And meanwhile, we're having a debate. They've already announced that they're going to rip away some support in the family tax benefit for stay-at-home mums to the tune of about $1,000 for those that are having children.
Let me go to Senator Cormann, though, specifically before we move on from this issue on subsidies for the automotive sector. Can you just clarify for us what is the Coalition's position on this? Does it remain the case that you have only agreed to what the Howard government had previously promised, and that means post-2015 there's actually nothing on the table from the Coalition?
Well, we have committed to appropriately targeted, fiscally sustainable support for the automotive industry, and what is very clear today is that after the carbon tax and a number of broken promises in terms of assistance from the Gillard government and you know, millions and millions of dollars of subsidies from the Gillard government, it hasn't actually made any difference, and that is very sad to see. But ultimately what you can see is that it actually hasn't achieved the outcome the government promised it would achieve. In fact, when the Prime Minister announced the most recent multi-million-dollar subsidy, she said this will lead to the increase in jobs at Ford. We will get 300 more jobs. A couple of weeks later, Ford cut the number of jobs by about 300. So, I mean, you can just keep putting more and more money into something that is not ultimately going to make a difference. Or you're actually going to work on having a competitive environment where government lets business get on with it, where you've got less red tape, where you've got fewer taxes, and where people just can essentially pursue the business opportunities that's the outset.
Let's move on. I want to talk about the structural deficit. We saw last week the forecast return to surplus in 15-16 and 16-17. That seems to be undermined by two independent reports released yesterday by the Treasury and by the Parliamentary Budget Office, which show structural deficits remaining well beyond that point. Doesn't that undermine the government's forecasts?
No, clearly you're not understanding what a structural deficit or a structual balance is.
I understand what it is, but it's assuming, aren't you assuming that commodity prices are going to be
I'll explain what those two reports were about. And it's clear, we should be clear about this, that the Parliamentary Budget Office and the Treasury both released reports yesterday that have a look at the structural balance of the budget. Now, what does that mean? If you strip away one-off fluctuations, so things like GFCs, things like recessions that come along, things like booms in our terms of trade, you strip those things away and you look at the structure of our expenditure on one side versus the structure of our revenue on the other side. And then you try and determine whether, in a structural sense, the budget is in balance or deficit or surplus. Now, what the Parliamentary Budget Office found in its report yesterday, and it is an independent body, it released its report which said from about 2002-2003, the structural position of the budget started to deteriorate. Up until the point in 2006-2007, which of course was before we came into office, the budget had moved into a structural deficit position. Now, it is true, as Matthias says, that when we came into office there was a surplus in the bank, but if you look at the structural position of the budget, you take away the one-off impacts of the mining boom as they were flowing through, decisions that had been taken during the period of the Howard government had meant that the structural position of the budget was getting worse.
Well, okay, can I ask you then, no, David, but David, I want to ask you, given that underlying assessment of the strength of the Australian economy, if you're wrong, as the Treasury has been repeatedly over recent years on commodity prices, doesn't that undermine your projected surplus, the wafer-thin projected surplus? If you're wrong, as they've been many, many times, it shows that the underlying strength of the economy, well, it's problematic.
Well, to just round up the loop on what I was saying, because it is important to make this final connection, the Parliamentary Budget Office also made the point that the last two budgets, this budget and the one before, we have seen a bigger and more significant consolidation in redressing that structural deficit that had been occurring. And it also made the point that two of the things that we are funding in this budget, education reforms and disability care, that we have made sufficient room in order to fund them in the future. The other point the Parliamentary Budget Office made was that they said two of the factors that have helped in redressing that structural imbalance have been the carbon pricing mechanism and also the minerals resource rent tax. Now, the opposition are proposing to repeal both of them, and in the case of the carbon pricing mechanism, they say we will get rid of the revenue source, but we will continue to fund the expenditure.
Okay, well, let's
now,
go
that will drive the budget
Senator
into further
Cormann,
structural
with
deficit
the carbon
down the
tax
track.
gone, the opposition leader said repeatedly, if you don't have the tax, you don't need the compensation. You are keeping those tax cuts. Doesn't that add to the structural deficit?
Well, let me firstly just correct one of the things that David has just said. According to the Parliamentary Budget Office, the budget was actually in structural surplus until 07-08, which of course was the time of the change of government. Secondly, the way you worsen the structural position of the budget is by introducing massive new taxes, which has got volatile revenue attached to it, and then link it to promises which are costly with a cost that is increasing over time. Like, so the mining tax, which was always going to be, even if it had raised everything the government said it would raise, which was always going to be a highly volatile revenue source, the government linked it to about a dozen promises, budget measures, which were going to increase in cost over time. So the revenue was going to be volatile and downward trending, and the expenditure was going to be increasing over time, and the budget was going to be more and more exposed over time. Now, the carbon tax, with the carbon tax, the government predicted that over the first 4 years it would raise $25 billion, but they spend about $30 billion in associated measures. Now, that is how you weaken the structural position of the budget. Now, what we've said is we're going to get rid of most of the compensation attached to the carbon tax, because once you haven't got the carbon tax, you don't need the compensation. You don't provide assistance to industry, to emissions-intensive and trade-exposed industry for the carbon price impact if there's no carbon price.
The tax cuts remain.
However, what we have said is that at the upper end, what we will do, because we believe in lower taxes, and because we believe in appropriate support for pensioners, and because we believe in helping people with their cost of living pressures, we will fund income tax cuts without a carbon tax, and we will fund pension increases without a carbon tax. And the way we do it, let me just get to the final part of the sentence. The way we will do it is through a range of savings measures that Tony Abbott has announced in his budget reply speech last week, among others, by delaying the full phase-in of the increase in compulsory super to 12% from 2019 to 2021. Now, that is actually, not only does that help us fund income tax cuts and pension increases without a carbon tax, it also actually helps people who are saving for their retirement have more money pre-retirement, which they can use on paying their mortgage, electricity costs, and save if they so choose. But it also helps business, because to the extent that the increase in compulsory super is paid for by business, slowing down the rate of increase helps business at this point in time when we are facing some particular challenges.
You must concede, though, the Parliamentary Budget Office said that a big shift in terms of the structural strength of the budget were those 2007 tax cuts, which Peter Costello committed to and then the Labor Party embraced. So both sides of politics have to take accountability, surely, for the structural deficit that we face today?
Well, hang on. We have not been in government for the last 6 years.
They were the coalition tax cuts, weren't they?
But they were the coalition tax cuts, and we weren't able, because we were no longer in government, to roll out the remainder of our program. I mean, from our point of view, lower taxes are always better to help stimulate stronger economic growth, because ultimately, if the economy grows more strongly, not only is that good for our prosperity as a nation, not only is that good for our superannuation returns, it's actually also good for government revenue, because the stronger the economy grows, the more revenue you collect without the need for all these new taxes.
David Bradbury, your response to that, and I want to also ask you about, well, the prospect of further cuts. You've spoken about some of the measures. The baby bonus is one. What about the school kids bonus? It's the same thing. It's a payment, but it's a flat payment. How is that not the same principle?
I'll come to that in a moment, if I can just respond to the comments that were made about the extent to which the government is taxing people. Now, there is one measure. This is the universal measure for how you determine the levels of taxation at the Commonwealth level in the economy. And that is, you look at the size of the economy and you say, what is taxation collected by the government as a percentage of the size of the economy? Now, at the moment, it is 21.5%. When we came into office, it was 23.7%. Now, every 1% you increase that, what we call the tax to GDP ratio, that is the equivalent of an extra $15 billion worth of revenue. Now, we are collecting less revenue today as a percentage of the size of the economy than we were when we came into office. Now, there are some people out there that say, well, you should increase tax to get that back up. We think that there's a combination of structural factors as well as cyclical ones. So we are, in terms of the increase to the Medicare levy, which is a contribution towards funding disability care, we will be seeing that come up a little in the future, but it won't be getting back up to 23.7%. Can I address your question, Kieran, in relation to the school kids bonus? We took the decision in this budget to abolish the baby bonus. Now, I know that not everybody will be pleased with that decision, and I saw articles from the front page of the local paper through to the Daily Telegraph criticising the government for that decision. But we took the decision that it is much more important to provide support to families at those times when they need it most, and in particular supporting families through the family payment system, through support in the form of the school kids bonus, which is a tremendous support to families in electorates and communities like this, to ensure that parents that are doing the heavy lifting in our community of raising the next generation have the support that they need to make sure they can send their kids off to school to get the education that we are working so hard to deliver improvements in with the states and territories. And you know that working with Barry O'Farrell here in New South Wales, we've struck an agreement that we hope can be implemented to deliver an increase in educational opportunity to kids all around this state.
And we're going to get back to that in a moment. I want to give Senator Cormann a chance to reply, particularly to that issue of the tax to GDP ratio.
Well, I mean, essentially, very conveniently, David has excluded a significant component from his stats. I mean, like there's $191 billion worth of deferred taxation, which is what government debt is. Government debt is deferred taxation, which of course he fails to include into his stats. If you actually add all of the taxes which the current Labor government has imposed on future generations by courtesy of the fact that they've not been able to live within their means, courtesy of the fact that they've spent more than what they've raised in revenue, then the tax to GDP ratio, the total call on resources to GDP ratio is actually in excess of 25%.
Will it be lower under you? Are you committing to have a lower tax to GDP ratio?
I know that you would like me, on behalf of the coalition, to release our pre-election costings today. No, we will do that in good time before the next election. Like today, we're here to talk about your budget, David. Very happy to do that.
It's actually a simple proposition. If Matthias makes the claim that this is a high taxing government,
which
and he says that we are a high taxing government, and objectively the figures show that as a proportion of the economy, the government is collecting 21.5% of that in revenue.
More than 30.
Will he give a commitment that overall levels of taxation will be lower under a coalition government?
Because I give a commitment that under the coalition taxes will be lower than they are under Labor, for sure.
On that measure.
Let's go to the issue of the Treasury forecast. Now, you've been critical of the budget forecasts, and the opposition Treasury spokesman Joe Hockey says they can't be believed, that they've been fudged, essentially. How can you say that on the one hand and on the other say you have faith in the Department of Treasury?
Well, we have total faith in the Department of Treasury. We hold Martin Parkinson, the Treasury Secretary, in very high regard. But what we've got to remember, and what the Treasury Secretary said earlier this week, and what he said to me in Senate estimates earlier in the year, the budget document, the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook, they are the government's documents. They are political documents. The only budget update that is published under the sole authority of the Secretary of the Treasury and the Secretary of the Finance Department is the pre-election economic and fiscal outlook. Earlier this year I asked Treasury, is it the case that if the government wanted to maintain exaggerated carbon price assumptions to estimate its carbon tax revenue, that they could do so? And the answer was explicit, yes they can. It is the government's document. It is ultimately the government's decision as to what assumption they use. Now, our view is that Wayne Swan and Penny Wong have completely got their budget forecasting wrong. They've deliberately and intentionally and dishonestly, we would say, overestimated revenue. In last year's budget, their forecast of a budget surplus was predicated on the proposition that revenue would increase by nearly 12%. At a time when Treasury was suggesting that the economy was going to grow more slowly and that the terms of trade were going to fall by 5.75%. Now, government revenue has not risen by nearly 12% since 1986, when the economy was growing by more than 5% and our terms of trade were growing by more than 8%. It was never going to happen. But of course, the political strategy of a government that was trying to keep the illusion of an early surplus in 2012-13 alive for as long as possible, they deliberately overestimated revenue, they deliberately underestimated expenditure. In this budget, they're trying to make us believe that the boat arrivals will reduce by 40%. It's not going to happen. Now, when you've got these sorts of assumptions in the budget which are imposed by the government of the day, which are not there because they're Treasury's decisions, then you end up with the sort of circumstances we've ended up this year, where over a 3 or 4 week period, we've had the Prime Minister, the Treasurer and the Finance Minister and the Assistant Treasurer all out there on a weekly basis, giving us a new figure on how much the revenue had supposedly collapsed by. It went from 7.5 billion to 12 billion to 17 billion.
Surely the government of the day has to take accountability for the numbers that you deliver.
Look, I want to be really clear about something Matthias said that is absolutely incorrect, is that he was suggesting that somehow the figures in the budget are different to the figures that have been provided by the Treasury. And Martin Parkinson, Dr Parkinson, the head of the Treasury, a very well-respected public servant that has served under both governments of both persuasions, got up and gave a speech. And he made it absolutely clear that the pre-election fiscal outlook, which is the document that is prepared ahead of the election by the Secretary of the Treasury and the Secretary of Finance, had that document been required to be prepared today, then those figures in the budget would have been exactly the same figures. Now,
but what else is he meant to say? He's your Treasury boss today. He's hardly going to contradict you.
Can I make the point that former Treasury bosses have contradicted the government of the day, and
not on budget figures.
They have. In relation to a range of matters. And I don't want to go through the details of Ken Henry and comments that he had to make in the final days of the Howard government. But what I will say is this, that this is an absolute furphy. Yes, the figures have been revised, and as a government we would prefer that they did not have to be revised, the revenue write-downs that we faced. Now, but the reality is that I don't sit there in an office with Wayne Swan and Penny Wong and we pluck these figures out of the air. We have the advice of the Treasury. These are the same people, committed public servants that have served under both governments. They provide that advice to the best of their ability. And acting upon that advice, the government hands down its budget. Now, if that doesn't end up being exactly the case, then that would probably be no different to every other budget that's been handed down. And in fact, we all know that when the former government was in office, variations between forecasts and what came in were often very, very wide of the mark as well.
There's an important point here. Company tax issues here. One of the changes in the budget is the tax treatment for companies moving to a monthly basis for payment. Doesn't that simply add to red tape and also hit cash flow?
First point to make is that only impacts on large businesses. large businesses, and it'll be phased in over a period of time. A $20 million turnover will ultimately be the threshold we will hit years down the track, but it will start with businesses at much higher levels than that. Can I make this point? To small businesses that are in this room that deal with those large companies, I wonder whether they extend to them payment terms on the same cycle that the government currently does to these companies. We are now requiring them to pay the tax that they owe on a monthly basis. They already do that in relation to their GST instalments, and that has been the case from day one. We want to make sure that that comes through in a more timely way. But the more significant changes that we've made in relation to corporate tax matters have gone to cracking down on some of the loopholes that exist within the corporate tax base, where multinational corporations have been avoiding paying their fair share as a result of loopholes that have been in place. And we've put in place a package of measures that will ensure that around an extra $4 billion of revenue will be collected. And I make this point, that if you think that doesn't affect you, think again. Because if the most profitable companies in the world generating economic activity in our country are not paying their fair share of tax, then who do you think has to put their hand in their pocket to contribute more tax in order to fund the public goods and services we rely upon? It's small businesses, it's mums and dads, it's pensioners and it's families in our community.
But to be effective on that, surely you need the international agreement, the G20, other nations need to sign on, don't they?
Well, that's absolutely correct. And I make the point that not in relation to the specific budget measures, but there are some challenges in global taxation that we are tackling at a global level. If I can just make a really significant point about some of the things that we've been doing in government. In the time I've been at the Assistant Treasurer, we have brought into the Parliament measures to protect revenue, to crack down on loopholes and to stop tax avoidance in the tune of $11 billion. Every time we've brought those measures into the Parliament, they've been opposed by the opposition. And now yesterday I see Mr Hockey saying that he wants to break the tax office up and weaken their powers. A really significant thing happened this week. Towards the end of last year I gave a speech about how some multinational tech companies were avoiding paying their fair share of tax. In the US, in the last couple of days, we've seen evidence before a Senate committee that has indicated that as part of the Apple group of companies, Apple Operation International, which is one of their holding companies, that this particular company over a 4-year period generated $30 billion worth of net income and did not pay $1 of tax in any country in the world. Now, these are the sorts of challenges that through international cooperation, this is an issue we've put on the agenda, and as a result of the issues that I've been raising, the Treasurer has also elevated this to the G20.
Okay.
If we can tackle these issues and make sure that companies that are generating so much income are paying their fair share, it will certainly alleviate the burden on others.
Senator Cormann, I want to get your thoughts on all of those issues. First of all, we'll get to the international multinationals. The first point, though, on paying monthly for companies, would you unwind that measure?
Well, we haven't said that we would unwind it. Like we will be releasing our policy, of course, in good time before the next election, and you'll have to wait for that. But what we have said, and what is very clear, that was just another accounting trick and another money shuffle, where the government was bringing forward $8 billion worth of revenue into the forward estimates period at the expense of business, in order to keep the illusion of a surplus in 2012-13 alive for a little bit longer. And now, of course, it's gone anyway. And now, some of the other issues that David has just mentioned, because I mean, there are really 3 different issues. One was this issue. The other is in relation to the so-called tax integrity measures and the $11 billion worth of protection of revenue. Well, the measures that David is talking about are retrospective changes to taxation.
That's not
true. Some of the changes went back as far as 2004. Now, I mean, the truth of the matter is, as a matter of fundamental principle, we believe that taxpayers should not be hit with retrospective changes to tax, because you cannot be expected to have complied with the law that you didn't know existed at the time. Now, he will say it's not retrospective because it's just confirming the tax office understanding of the law. Now, the truth of the matter is that the tax office, every now and then, pursues taxpayers in the courts because they say our view of the law is X. And the taxpayer says, no, we think that's wrong. Our view of the tax law is Y. And the court says, well, you taxpayer, you're right. And so what this government is doing is that when the court says the law is like this, you tax officer, you're wrong, they're going in and they want to change the law retrospectively in this occasion, going back all the way to 2004 and imposing tax changes retrospectively. We think that's wrong. Now, the final point, in relation to the tax obligations in Australia of multinational companies, of course, I mean, that is an area where we do share some of the concerns that have been expressed by the government, and we're supportive of the work the government is doing in terms of ensuring that companies pay their fair share of tax for profits that are generated in Australia. And of course, through multinational structures, there has been a growing incidence of shifting costs to Australia, shifting profits to other parts of the world in an effort to minimise tax obligations here in Australia. And to the extent that we can take sensible action both internationally and domestically, to make sure that Australia gets its fair share of tax in relation to profits that are generated in Australia. And of course we're supportive of that.
What about the suggestion by the Minister that Joe Hockey's suggestion yesterday, or proposal, that the coalition might look at separating the administrative and policing arms of the tax office? Will that reduce its clout?
Well, we are concerned that the way the tax office is currently structured, and we're very supportive of the work that Chris Jordan, as the tax commissioner, is doing to sort of try and change some of the culture in the tax office and some of their attitudes. And it was a good appointment by this government, the appointment of Chris Jordan as tax commissioner. But what we're concerned about is that if you've got the tax office administering the law at the same time as pursuing the prosecution function, when they don't get their way through their prosecutions, all they do is they change their interpretations of the law, and it becomes very difficult for the taxpayer to actually get a fair dealing through the tax office. And so what we've said is, in the short term, we want to see how successful Chris Jordan is in making some of the changes he's intent on making, but we reserve the right to make structural change to the tax office, because we think that there is an inherent conflict where the way it operates at the moment, which essentially puts taxpayers across Australia at an unfair disadvantage when they are in conflict with the tax office.
Okay, I know that you wanted to interject on one of those points. I'll let you provide a brief reply, but then I do want to ask you, Minister, being the local member here, infrastructure, roads are a huge issue, not just for people commuting, but productivity. You've said you'll fund part of the WestConnect project, but you want a series of conditions met. They haven't been met. This is just more another feud with the state government, where I thought we were meant to end the blame game, weren't we?
Can I just, as you've given me the opportunity to respond to what Matthias has said, firstly, there is a bill before the Parliament at the moment that where more than $4 billion worth of revenue is at stake, and it involves strengthening our general anti-avoidance rule, which is what is used to crack down on tax avoidance, and strengthening our transfer pricing rules. Now, there would be no businesses, or very few businesses, I would suggest, in this room that would ever have anything to fear when it comes to transfer pricing. The very issues I was talking about in relation
from
to
the tax office,
when I was talking about multinational exploitation of loopholes, transfer pricing is in fact one of the areas that is being abused. Now, we have a bill before the Parliament to strengthen those powers. The opposition in the House voted against it. And yesterday, when Joe Hockey was asked about transfer pricing and whether their powers were adequate, he said they were currently inadequate. I simply ask the question, why are they voting against these measures that are ensuring that companies that are generating huge profits worldwide, that are not paying their fair share of tax in Australia, are getting away with it? In relation to the question you've asked, Kieran, about infrastructure, obviously, one of the things that I've always been passionate about in this community is that we need to create more jobs locally, and that has always been the thing that's been first and foremost in my thinking. And that's why one of the projects that I was pleased the government was able to support through suburban jobs was the $13.5 million, working with the Council, the University of Western Sydney and the Penrith Business Alliance, to encourage the creation of jobs here in our local community, and that Innovation Campus will be an important generator of jobs. The other thing we're doing is rolling out the National Broadband Network, and that will give rise to opportunities for new business activity, new jobs being created without people having to travel to work each day. And that will be an enormous game changer in terms of the numbers of people that leave our city for work each day. On the WestConnects, I'm really straightforward on my position on this. As someone that does spend a bit of time driving on the M4, I drive on the M4, you get to the end of the M4 at Concord, and the rest of the trip takes as long as the trip from here to the end of the M4. Now, if we're going to build an extension to the M4 that doesn't go all the way into the city, frankly, I think that's a waste of money. I think it's a waste of money because the majority of people travelling on the M4 all the way into Concord, they go all the way into the city. If you're going to go and spend billions of dollars and then simply dump people further up on Parramatta Road, that doesn't make sense. The other condition that we've imposed, and I think this is absolutely fair as well, is that we've said we don't mind if there's a new toll on a new road. But this idea that you're going to reintroduce a toll on a road that people are currently driving on for free, and I'm talking about the stretch between Parramatta and Concord. The state government is talking about putting a toll on to charge people to drive along that stretch of road that they currently drive on for free. And this is a direct contradiction of the Deputy Premier, the commitment that he gave, Mr Stoner, in opposition, that he said we will not be imposing any tolls on roads that people currently drive on for free. Now, if I'm being accused because I'm standing up on these two principles and saying we're going to hand over $1.8 billion, but only if you tick those boxes. If I'm being accused of not being cooperative, then I simply say cooperation will not deliver what our community needs.
All right, let's get Senator Cormann's response.
Well, I mean, the coalition has made a very clear commitment, $1.5 billion towards the WestConnex project. We will make it happen together with the state government, and indeed, under our approach, it would start happening next year. Now, what Julia Gillard has done, she's essentially imposed so many conditions that the cost of the project would increase by another $6 billion. Under her plan, it won't actually start happening until 2019, 6 years from now. I mean, in short, it just won't happen. What we've put on the table is realistic. It'll happen in the short term. It is a firm $1.5 billion commitment, and it fits with the state government's planned approach to this project. So we think that we've got a much superior policy compared to the current government.
What about your view on regional cities, centres like Penrith is technically defined, and we know that there are similar cities on the edge of our major centres right around Australia, that the infrastructure issues remain there. The NBN is something the government points to. What does the coalition argue you will do for those cities on the periphery of our major cities?
Well, as we've said, I mean, infrastructure, it's very true to say that there's a body of work to be done in order to have that beneficial impact on our productivity growth. And we've made announcements in relation to a whole range of projects, including the WestConnex project here in New South Wales and other projects in Victoria, Queensland and so on. And of course, I mean, across Australia, infrastructure will be one of those significant priorities of an Abbott-led coalition government. Now, as far as the NBN is concerned, we actually believe that we have a much more superior plan there too, because we will be able to deliver faster, better broadband, more affordably for the taxpayer, $29 billion instead of the $90 billion that the current government will have to put on the line for its current project, more affordably for consumers. And of course, I mean, under the current government's approach, quite frankly, not much has been happening. They talk a lot about the NBN, they make a lot of promises about the NBN, but when it comes to actual tangible outcomes in communities across Australia, they're very slow coming.
When you talk about the Gonski reforms, which you alluded to earlier, the school funding model that the Gillard government wants to implement, you've only got one state on board. It's not very convincing as an argument that this is a national plan with one state.
Well, and we're still working towards that. We've set a deadline a little bit later in the year, and you could have said exactly the same thing when we got Barry O'Farrell to sign up on disability care. And if I'd taken your advice back then and pulled up stumps and walked away, then Australia wouldn't have just legislated disability care to make sure that people with disabilities have the opportunity to realise their potential and make a contribution in our society in the way that they deserve to. We are ambitious about our future, and we believe that investing in education is going to make a huge difference, not just to the lives of the people that will get the benefit of that better education, but we know it's going to lift productivity in our economy. It's going to make our economy stronger. Mr O'Farrell knows that. And I'm suggesting that I think over the coming period you will see other states, Labor and Liberal, that will sign up to this deal because they understand that if we want to be a smart country in the future, we've got to make investments in education. I speak very passionately and personally about this because I was the first person in my family to graduate with a university degree. And I know how much of a difference education makes to the opportunities that we have in life. It doesn't mean that you have to get an education to succeed, but I tell you what, it opens up some doors and gives you some opportunities, and I want every kid in communities like this to have that same opportunity, and that's why we're working so hard.
It's not a great look for a Liberal frontbencher to say the New South Wales Premier has been conned. Surely Barry O'Farrell, one of the most senior Liberals in Australia, as Premier, would look at the numbers and say, OK, this is a good deal for our state.
Well, Barry O'Farrell is a great Premier for the great state of New South Wales, but of course, as an alternative national government, we've got to have a bit of a look at what the government is doing nationally. And nationally, the Gillard government is conning people. Because if you look at the numbers, over the current forward estimates, over the next 4 years, the government is actually cutting funding for schools by $326 million. They're actually cutting funding to universities by $2.8 billion. What the government is saying is if we're still around in 5 years' time, at that point in time, we'll give you this huge boost in funding. I mean, that is a bit... Imagine if you go to your employer and your employer comes to you and he says, I want you to accept a pay cut for the next 4 years, but if I'm still your boss in 5 years' time, I'm going to give you a pay rise, a substantial pay rise in 5 years' time. Would you enter into that sort of deal with Julia Gillard if she was your employer?
Hasn't the government forecast, looked at index growth in school funding at 3.9% when the average over the last decade has been closer to 6%? Yeah. Aren't you underestimating to basically overdo your suggestion of how much you provide?
No, we're not, and there's a really simple response so you understand why that is the case. That the indexation level that we increase funding for schools at the federal level, it is linked to an index that is based upon expenditure in education at the state level. So what we have seen in recent years has been massive cutbacks in terms of the amount of money that has been invested by state governments. So that index has dropped massively. And what it means is that...
you haven't over-egged it at all.
No, but what it means is if we don't do what we are doing, then that index as it currently stands will kick in. And that will mean a substantial... So the alternative here is do nothing rather than implement our plan. If you do nothing, that will mean an automatic and massive reduction in spending because that index has been lowered as a result of the significant cuts that have occurred at the state level, in particular in places like Queensland and New South Wales and Victoria, where education funding has been savaged. That's impacted on the benchmark, which will mean that funding will drop. So let's be clear about this. There is a choice. We either continue to invest and we will have the indexation level that we've said. You can say that that's not as much as we've seen at some points in the future, but I tell you what, if that does not occur, and it seems to have satisfied Mr O'Farrell, but if that doesn't occur, then what we will see is an automatic and massive reduction in funding for schools.
So what David is saying is that state Labor governments in New South Wales and Queensland have cut spending on education, which is why the federal government essentially automatically is now cutting spending on education.
Absolutely
That's really
not.
what he's saying.
I'm saying that there's been a Liberal government here for a couple of years now, and it's not a secret, it's not a state secret, that they ripped $1.7 billion out of education. And up in Queensland, we've seen a lot of money ripped out of education there as well. And this is an annual calculation, and as that indexation benchmark is affected, then that flows through to the funding that we automatically have to provide. I don't want to get bogged down in the details, so
let's go to the floor now, bring in some questions from the audience, ladies and gentlemen. We are joined here by many local business people and community representatives. Can I invite you? We do have a microphone ready to come to you if you've got any questions for the two gentlemen. We do. There's two down here. Thank you. If you could introduce yourself, where you're from and your question.
Hi, I'm Shane Conlon, Director of National Technical Services, been running business for 14 years in the St Mary's area. I'm also a parent and have one child still at school. I was at the PNC meeting this week. I'm president of our PNC at the high school, and our principal was talking about the Gonski report, and I just wanted to get some Senator Cormann's advice, because it seems to me that there's a lot of negativity about the Gonski report, but from the coalition federal coalition, which I don't understand. So can you describe to me how the coalition would fix the current schools funding scheme that everybody seems to agree is broken? I think there's a pretty universal acceptance that that funding scheme doesn't work. And just explain to me what you would do instead of Gonski. What would you in its place?
Well, firstly, thank you for that question. And let me say very clearly there's no negativity from the coalition about Gonski. Our negativity is about the bad and incompetent Gillard Labor government in Canberra, which has a bad track record when it comes to implementing major changes. And of course, if we look at what the government is actually doing rather than what they're promising they will do sometime in 5 or 6 years from now without putting proper detail behind it, then actually right now the government is cutting spending on schools and is cutting spending on universities. So what we say is that while people might have some issues with the current methodology to distribute funding, the current indexation formula is actually quite generous, and in the absence of something better, then we would rather stick with the current formula. Now, obviously, moving forward, we will be making our very specific announcements on how we will approach the sorts of issues that you ask about this today. We will be making announcements in good time before the next election to lay out some of the specifics. But let me just say as a matter of principle, with this government, you've got to look at what they do and not what they say. And over the next 4 years, the government is cutting spending. And I mean, do you expect that the government will be there in 5 years' time to deliver on their promises this year? I mean, you can't believe the promises that Labor makes from one budget to the next. I mean, last year they said they would fund increases in family tax benefit A payments. This year they've gone. And of course that increase replaced a promised company tax cut the year before, which was scrubbed in last year's budget. I mean, from one budget to the next, they make promises in one budget and scrub them in the next budget. Do you really think you can trust their promises in 5 years' time?
Let's get David Bradbury, quick response, and then we'll get another question.
Well, Christopher Pyne, who is the education spokesman for the coalition, has said that he doesn't believe the system is broken. Now, he must be Robinson Crusoe, because as I get around the place and I talk to people, I think there is an understanding and an acceptance that we need to come up with a better system. We've gone through a process. David Gonski led a review panel, made a series of recommendations to government, and we are committed and determined to try and do that. Okay. And I think there'll be a very clear choice for people at the next election on this issue.
Let's have another question if we can.
Thank you. Glenn Melross, local accountant. This is on superannuation. Mrs Keating and Hawke, when they introduced the superannuation and productivity offset measures, the government came out and announced a 33% increase in the compulsory superannuation that employers have to contribute without any productivity. I'd like that to be justified. And I'd like to ask Matthias there, when they do their review, can they review that and it be unintroduced if there's productivity offsets for that? Because within the superannuation, I noticed Mr Shorten was, prior to these announcements, was saying there's a lot of rich people with money in funds, super funds, not paying any tax whatsoever, and yet the government squib attacking that, yet they attack small businesses and the money has to come out of their personal pockets to contribute.
Well, let me just say, firstly, I mean, the coalition strongly supports superannuation. We think that as a nation we need to continue to dedicate ourselves to encourage as many Australians as possible to save as much as they can so that they can get themselves into a position where they can look after their own needs in retirement and not have to rely on the age pension. Now, having said that, we do recognise that obviously increasing compulsory super is a cost on business. When that particular measure went through the Parliament, the government was trying to make people believe that somehow they were taking money out of Gina Rinehart's pockets and out of Clive Palmer's pockets and putting it into a superannuation account near you. But of course, I mean, they were trying to make people believe that the mining tax was somehow going to fund increases in superannuation payments. But of course, that's not true. What the cost to the budget is that if more of your own money goes into superannuation rather than being taken as take-home pay, because you pay lower tax on the money that goes into super, that's where the cost to the budget comes in. Now, we, because it was linked to the mining tax, because it wasn't, the cost to the budget wasn't funded, we were opposed to it when it went through the Parliament, but we said we would not be rescinding it. Now, the government's budget impact is actually based on an assumption that the money does come out of people's wages. To the extent that the increase in compulsory super comes out of people's wages, slowing down the rate of increase actually leaves people with more of their money now pre-retirement, which they can use to deal with cost of living pressures, or they can save if they so wish. But there is, of course, a cost to business. We're mindful of it. That is one of the reasons why we think it's quite appropriate for us to delay the increase from 9 to 12 by 2 years.
Okay, let's get David Bradbury, your answer to that question.
Well, superannuation is one of the great reforms that a Labor government introduced, and our country has a lot to thank those reforms for. During the global financial crisis, the pool of funds that were available in super helped sustain our economy. So you're absolutely right. It was a good and positive reform. In terms of what Senator Cormann has just said, he's made the point that we do assume that as that flows through, that will to some extent be offset in the pay rises that people can expect into the future, because it's an overall remuneration package that employers will be providing. But we've made a commitment that we want to see superannuation, the compulsory contribution, go from 9 to 12%. And one of the interesting things about what Senator Cormann has just said is that he accepts that logic, that it essentially is about a compensating element in terms of the wage that is paid. And he basically said that workers will be better off. That's what he said. Workers will be better off if they don't get that superannuation
having more of
for
their
those
money
2
now,
years.
so they can deal with cost of living pressure.
I think what people have to be very concerned about is that we've been through this before. It's Groundhog Day. In 1996, when John Howard came into power, he went to an election saying that he would continue the Keating government's proposals to increase superannuation from 9 to 12%. Once he got in, after having made that commitment, he halted it immediately, and we've never gone above that except for the latest reforms by Labor. We think it's critical that we keep moving up towards the 12%. For a 30-year-old on average weekly earnings, it will increase their retirement savings by $100,000 a year. We think this is crucial. We want to see it happen, but I think the Australian people need to look at the proposal that has been announced by the Liberals and see it for what it is. It's not a deferral. It is an intention to ditch that increase, and you won't see it. You won't see it go up to 12%. If they get in, they will do exactly what we saw the Howard government do in 1996.
Okay, let's go again to the floor. We've got another question. Thanks, sir.
From University of Western Sydney, Institute for Infrastructure Engineering. My question is, recently there was an announcement about the industry innovation precincts. I think it's worth $53 million. I would like to ask Senator Cormann whether it will stay under coalition. Yeah.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I'm not aware of the local project that you're talking about. I mean, so I'm happy to talk to you separately.
It's part of the innovation plan.
Sure, but I'm happy to talk about the specifics with you afterwards, so that I make sure that I get the answer right for you.
Any other questions from the floor? We've still got about 5 or so minutes. If you've got a question, please put your hand up. Don't be shy. We do. The gentleman down the front here. Thank you.
Steve Archer's my name, from Bank of Queensland in Penrith. I'm going to go back onto something that's a little bit passionate for all of us here. I'm going to go back to the WestConnex. David, I think you issued a number of 1.8 billion and Matthias 1.5 billion. From my understanding of what you two said, that it wasn't going to complete it either way. Why the variance in funds, and why can't David's complete it, and why can yours complete the connection to WestConnex into the city for us here out in the West?
Well, I mean, essentially, the Prime Minister has added so many additional conditions onto the WestConnex project that the cost is going to go up by $6 billion. And of course, the state government is not inclined, as I understand it, to go along with what the Prime Minister has put in as a precondition. I mean, if I was cynical, I would suggest that she put on so many conditions to the project so that she essentially had an excuse as to why it wasn't going to happen. I mean, anyone can promise to put $1.8 billion on the table. You can put $5 billion on the table if you know that you're never going to have to spend it, because the other party that is part of the project is not going to be able to go along with it. So, I mean, what I say is that we have made a very realistic commitment of $1.5 billion that fits in with the planning that is being done at a state level here in New South Wales. The $1.5 billion that we've put on the table will help deliver the project. It will help ensure that it can start next year instead of having to wait till 2019. Again, I mean, do you expect that Julia Gillard will be there to be accountable for her commitment today of committing $1.8 billion for a project that starts in 2019? I think it is better to go along with something that we know will actually work and that is based on the plans that have currently already been undertaken at the state level.
Look, that is absolute rubbish. Now, where this 2019 figure has come from absolutely astonishes me. Where did the 2019 figure come from?
Well, that is our analysis of what it is that you've committed to.
Well, that is rubbish.
Well, that is
in
not
the
rubbish.
same way,
Exactly
in the same way as this road,
my very good friend,
commence,
the New South Wales Liberal Senator for Western Sydney, is shaking her head at you, and I think she would know.
No, that's not correct. Well, she doesn't know.
Senator Maurice Payne, of course not.
Sorry, Maurice. As much as I like you, that's not correct.
Don't treat my chamber buddy like that.
Can I answer the question and make this point? And I'm going to take my hat off as Assistant Treasurer and Member for Lindsay, and I'm going to talk as local resident that lives in Claremont Meadows that drives in on that road.
I can't beat you there,
now,
I'm sorry.
You can't beat me. He's from the west, but just a bit further west. Look, what I would say is that I just think, I don't know who devised this plan, but why on earth would you extend the M4 and not go all the way to the city? It just doesn't make sense. And, you know, you can spend $20 billion on it, and you're wasting your money. Honestly. Or I'm crying out to Mr O'Farrell to acknowledge that we've got to fix that alignment. And I know that constructive discussions are occurring with the state government. So this idea that it's never going to happen, we will continue to talk very closely to them. But honestly, you know, do not build this thing if you're not going to build it to take it where it needs to go.
Okay, time for one more question, I think. And we do have the gentleman on the left.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is George Barsha. I'm councillor from Fairfield Council. Actually, we acknowledge the controls that you're taking concerning eliminating the loopholes in the tax system. Maybe it should be extended also to the other departments like health and social security.
Is there a Dorothy Dixer comment?
What also I want to ask is, have the government or maybe the coalition introducing anything concerning the imports from overseas that are damaging our local manufacturing to increase and help into creating local jobs?
Look, this is an issue that gets raised with me quite a bit, and I think that I have a very firm view on this, and it's a view that is reflected in the government's position, and I think probably also in the opposition's position, and that is that you don't make our economy stronger by simply putting tariffs on imports that come into the country. And in fact, as consumers, and I am also the Minister for Consumer Affairs, consumers get cheaper prices and they get more variety. And in fact, there are more Australian industries that benefit from free trade than there are competitor importers that get that benefit. And when you look at whether it be in areas like resources or agriculture, one of the great opportunities for us as a nation is that we're located in the Asian region at a time when the development occurring in that region is enormous. The real opportunity for us is to build linkages into those huge and growing markets in the Asian region so that the people producing goods and services and digging things up and planting things here in Australia have the opportunity to tap into markets that are in the billions of people. If we can do that, that's how we're going to make our economy more productive and stronger in the future. Increasing costs by putting tariffs on things as they come in through the border, that is not going to make us stronger, and it's going to make the cost of living even higher here in Australia.
Okay, let's get Senator Cormann. Quick response to wrap up.
David is quite right. We don't support tariffs on imports. We don't think that that is the right way to make our economy stronger. The way to make our economy stronger is by cutting taxes, and we, of course, will cut the carbon tax, which has pushed up the cost of electricity, which is pushing up the cost of doing business while shifting emissions and jobs overseas by making overseas emitters who are not facing the same impost more competitive than equivalent manufacturers here in Australia who have to pay higher electricity prices. We will be very serious about cutting red and green tape and bringing down the cost of compliance, and we will be very serious about measures to improve productivity growth again. I mean, if we get all of these things right, right, if we can grow the economy more strongly, it will generate more opportunity for manufacturing. But the best way to support manufacturing is by making sure that we help you bring down your cost of doing business so you can be internationally competitive, and so that you can not only be more competitive than the imports coming in, you can actually you can be more competitive in terms of the exports you might want to send out.
Senator Cormann, thank you for that. And ladies and gentlemen, our viewers at home right around Australia, thank you so much for being with us for this budget debate this afternoon. To all of those gathered here at Penrith Stadium, thank you for being here this afternoon. And a round of applause too for the Assistant Treasurer and Senator Cormann.
And that was the post-budget debate. David Bradbury and Matthias Cormann in Penrith, Western Sydney.